I hope you enjoyed the earlier part of this morning, including the Minister and our previous panel. Our next panel, which should be really interesting, reflecting Ireland's values in a renewed approach to the EU's international partnerships. I think we'll talk a lot about the multi-annual framework, what Ireland can do, and also in particular some of the points made by the Minister there when he talked about the stark challenges that exist, including crises, but also how the Irish government has a priority of saving development infrastructure amidst demands from some countries like Germany, the Netherlands and others for a vastly reduced EU budget. So the challenges there are immense. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our excellent panel and bring them onto the stage. Dr. Alexei Jones, Head of European Foreign and Development Policy at ECDPM, Dominic Crowley, CEO of Concern, Dr. Nadine Saba, Co-founder and Director of Akara Network for Development in Lebanon, Emily Wiggins, EU Director of One Campaign, and Barry Ward, Fine Gael TD and Chair of the Oireachtas Joint Committee for European Affairs. You're all very welcome to the stage. I might start off with you, Dominic, if that's okay, if that's all right. And we will have time again for questions as well. I thought Neil Richmond, his speech was excellent and it did hit all the right areas. In a way, it's going to be a hostage to fortune given the challenges that exist. Like I said, the aforementioned reduction in the budget, the prioritisation of security and defence for the EU. But he said that the priority for Ireland would be to save development infrastructure. And he said that the pace of it being undone is actually of the, I suppose, ruination of the or the challenges is quite striking. I mean, do you think? Well, I suppose, what's your response to that? And do you think Ireland has a chance of doing this within the next 6 months?
Thanks for the nice, easy opening question. I think from an NGO perspective, Minister Richmond's speech, and particularly the first half of the speech, was brilliant and exactly what we would like to hear. I think you're right to bring in that note of caution. So the government is going to be pulled in a million different directions. The biggest issue is going to be the negotiation of the MFF and how much will it actually be able to bring forward. But to be going into the presidency and to be going into the discussions with the determination to achieve and at least protect the humanitarian and development aid budget is a fundamentally important starting point for all of us. And if they can only do that, that will be a good start. So I think it'll be hugely challenging, but it's starting in the right way, going with the right intention.
Emily, can I ask you then, how do you see this ambition, the prioritisation, and also in fairness, very much the recognition of the damage that's been done to development infrastructure? How can that translate into action at the MFF?
So I think we have to recognise that Ireland has quite a special role in these negotiations. It has to play this kind of honest broker role, but I think we shouldn't confuse that with the lack of influence and the lack of ambition we should have for the Irish presidency, right? There's a lot of things that a presidency can do in order to shape the debate around the EU budget. From its convening power to the framing power it has, chairing those discussions and setting the agenda. So very concretely, I mean, the minister, he mentioned it already, right?
I'm just going to fix your microphone a small bit, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry. He mentioned, right, that there's going to be a Foreign Affairs Council for Development, and that's happening 1 week out from the next round of negotiations at head of state and government level on the MFF. So that conversation and the issues that development ministers tackle is really, really important for influencing the overall negotiations on the next 7-year budget. And I think that's an opportunity for the presidency to put forward issues that kind of came up in the first panel around, how do we value ODA today? It's often seen as an expense in these negotiations, but actually, can the Irish presidency help us make the case that this is not kind of a budgetary liability, but rather a strategic enabler for the European Union. So how can we use the presidency and that Foreign Affairs Council meeting to shift that perception? The second piece would be around kind of the balance of EU interests and partner countries' kind of longer-term development and climate aspirations, right? Can we have like a political conversation about how to manage and balance those things, and some of the risks that come with a more self-interested approach to ODA, and I'm thinking specifically there around migration conditionality. That's kind of be a really kind of very clear fault line in these negotiations. And then I think the third issue that they can tackle there is the issue around kind of flexibility, right? You know, what's the risk of the EU becoming a more reactive player globally? So I think if we can use the tools that the presidency has at its disposal, and then us as civil society, we take the minister's call to action like very seriously, and we translate that from a discussion of development ministers and make sure we're holding those governments to account for representing those same positions in the negotiations on the MFF. I think that would be like a very powerful thing that we can do, and how we can respond to the minister's call.
Alexei, with that point about the European Union changing the sort of structure of aid and development, and that it's becoming a lot more, well, transactional in so many ways, that it is also to do with the EU's own interests and not just about development and sort of altruism and so on. How do we bring the focus back?
Well, I think building on actually the exchange on the first panel, I do see the Global Gateway as a way to bring back some traction to development cooperation and aid. It poses a lot of questions, a lot of challenges. Global Gateway is certainly not the alpha and the omega of what the EU should do with its development cooperation and external action. I think that's also a way to bring back attention. And from that, indeed, the strong focus on this more mutual interest or interest-driven type of cooperation, which I think also resonates quite well in partner countries. So we're not shying away from also the interest behind it. But indeed, it is posing a lot of questions. And in MFF negotiations, particularly on the global Europe, are really essential, show all the tensions, the trade-offs, the challenges, sometimes the contradictions also that are taking place. So I do believe that it's a very timely, actually, moment for the Irish presidency to put on the table this important debate on the future of development cooperation at the moment where we are also negotiating the next long-term budget. And for me, this is indeed not only about the money. There's a lot of attention and concerns about whether or not the EU will live up to its ambitions with the budget proposed, but also a sense of purpose. And we clearly saw this morning very different perspectives on that. So I think this is a very important discussion to be had, probably even beyond the Irish presidency. I see there is indeed, and that's maybe a question, there's a lack of a sense of overarching framework, policy framework. The Global Gateway is used a lot, quite conveniently, I must say, because it can be sold differently to different constituencies. I think addressing civil society today, you would not hear the same type of discourse if the Commission were to speak to private sector entities. So it's also very convenient for the Commission, and I think that's the added value of the Global Gateway, to be able to sell it differently to different people. But what I feel is missing really is, and that will influence the budget, is a very fragmented overarching policy framework when it comes to international and European development cooperation. We have the Global Gateway. There were some references made in the room today to the European Consensus on Development. I must say in Brussels, we barely hear any more about the European Consensus on Development. It was actually absent from the Commission proposal on the Global Gateway, the Global Europe Instrument at first. So there's indeed a coexistence of different policies, ambitions, objectives, and what we miss is a sense of purpose. So I really hope that, and look forward to this discussion on the future of development cooperation to bring some clarity and probably some sense of prioritization as well in the future EU international and development cooperation.
Nadine, obviously you're living in Lebanon, you're from Lebanon, and you represent the civil society organisations there. And obviously, Lebanon is one of the countries at the epicenter of the crises that we're talking about that are ongoing. So sorry to hear everything that Lebanon is suffering right now. What would you see? What would you be saying that Ireland needs to push for as part of its role as an honest broker within the presidency? And how would you like to see the EU evolve when it comes to civil society organisations, support, and also development infrastructure?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start a bit with what Marlene was saying in terms of talking to civil society partners. It's great. Everything that I've been hearing today just ticks all the boxes, says all the buzzwords that everybody wants to hear, but at the same time, it opens a lot of questions. My first question would be, yes, you're listening, but are you acting upon it? Especially in times where you have different political, competing interests. How much is there a push within the different institutions of the EU to deal with civil society's requests and asks? The EU is still a political institution. I am not familiar with the intricacies of how things are moving. I'm more on the side of the person who is looking and sometimes receiving. So for me, when I hear what the minister said in terms of, saving development infrastructure, extremely nice, extremely ambitious, but are we all ready to live up to what this entails? Because that entails a paradigm shift. That entails all of us to look into the instruments, into the toolbox that we have in terms of development, in terms of humanitarian cooperation, and say, are these instruments still fit for purpose? Because things have changed drastically, whether in terms of the types of crises that we're facing, more and more of these crises are protracted crises, whether in terms of how the superpowers around us are dealing with crises, how we are dealing with international humanitarian law, with the values that everybody has been talking about, and how we are, all of us, wanting to just stick onto power. Because ultimately, if you want to save the development infrastructure, you need to really change a lot, and not on the side of the EU, but also on the side of the partner countries. I'm not saying, we're great, we're doing well, and it's just the fault to others. It's also us. But this is as well a question. In a certain regime, in a certain context, where you see corruption, where you see shrinking of civic space, what is adopted? Is it a policy of containment, or is it really pushing towards reform and towards good governance and towards dealing with having on a long-term good results? So for me, when I'm being asked about this, I wonder, do I say the nice things that everybody wants me to hear, or do I say the things as I see them? Because on the recipients, as a local NGO, sometimes I look at things and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. But there is nothing much I can do because of all the bureaucracy, because of all the things that are happening, because of sometimes we cannot articulate exactly how we want things, but at the same time, the other side is not helping.
So are you, just expand on that a little bit, are you saying that there's not enough pressure put on, let's say, partner countries to expand or support the civil society space?
I cannot speak on all contexts, because there is no context that is similar to the other.
Yeah, but let's say I'm just speaking about yours specifically.
If I look into the policies that have been adopted in Lebanon for the 20 years, can I say these were good policies? Definitely not. In Lebanon, every risk you could identify on your risk matrix have been done. We have been through everything, from the port explosion, to the pandemic that everybody was through, to the currency devaluation, to the armed conflict, to the refugee crisis from Syria, previously from Palestine. All of it has been there. And still, this country is going from, a crisis to the other. I sometimes feel that we are in a bottomless pit.
Yeah.
And still, this is a country that has received a lot of assistance. but what type of assistance and how has this been dispersed? We have received a lot of humanitarian assistance. For a good deal of time, we haven't had much access to development cooperation assistance because of corruption issues within the government.
So what would you like the EU to do then? Because obviously, there are so many spinning plates, and obviously Lebanon is a particularly challenging country. So what would you like to see happen to ensure that it's not just money, but the money and the support transfers into development, structural development?
It has to go on different layers, from civil society to local authorities to central government. You can still find in each context I remember my law professor said, in my first year of law, there isn't a law that has been passed that you cannot find a loophole or go around it. So even in a system that has corruption, if you have a will to go around and to talk to the people, and not only talk to the people, but act upon what these people have been telling you, whether working with civil society, whether working with local authorities, but you need to have a diversity, and you need to have the willingness to go around, check, and see what's most suited for this context. It's not, one recipe fits everybody. It's not one size fits all. It doesn't work that way. It adds to the work of everybody else, but it might give you better results than what we're having.
Before I move on to Barry, I might just come to you on that, Dominic, if you don't mind. Is that a fair point? Because you have a program, your program's in Lebanon.
We used to have. Yeah.
Oh, you don't anymore, okay. So I suppose, could you speak to that, or to those points about that maybe not enough has been done to expand civil society or support civil society organisations?
Yeah. I think for me, the bigger question is, and I think Alexi was touching on it, and it goes back to the earlier panel, it's almost the question of where aid is being used. And if we move away from the instruments that are being developed and we go back to the legal basis of the purpose of both development and humanitarian assistance, and you go back into the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, the articles in relation to development and humanitarian aid are very, very clear. The purpose of development aid is to reduce and eradicate poverty. And I think this morning's conversation was very much about how and where is that best done. When it comes to humanitarian aid, it's far more explicit in talking about responding to crises outside of the EU, responding to natural and man-made disasters. What's worrying about the Global Europe Instrument is that there is a danger that we will see the humanitarian budget going in the same way that many of us fear the development budget has gone, and that it will substantially neglect fragile states. So by definition, almost, Lebanon is an acutely fragile state, as you've expressed, this long series of repeated crises. So what's the best form of assistance that you can get? The perception that I would have from concern is you will not have stability, you will not have development, you will not have growth without peace. And the primary driver of hunger, displacement, need is conflict. Conflicts are growing in number and intensity, and the degree to which IHL is being violated in all of them. Guterres came to power as Secretary General on the promise of a resurgence of diplomacy for peace. He's being heavily criticized and accused of failing in his mission because he failed to deliver on that ambition. But if the member states, and particularly the Security Council member states, aren't committed to peace, I think very often all we're left with is sticking plasters.
Yeah.
But we need to deliver aid where it is most needed, not where it'll have the greatest economic return for the EU. We need to keep that focus on the most acutely in need people are largely in fragile contexts. And that's where we need to focus. And we need to have, as you've expressed, a diversified approach to that. But you have to have peace.
Very, very.
So sorry, it was a very long answer to your question.
No, brilliant.
But I need to intervene because this is not what we only expect and what we only want. This is what we have been living on for the last 20 and some years. I don't remember a day in my life where I didn't have an issue with whatever in this country. So my fear is that we stick to this without really pushing on the political option to influence other stakeholders to have peace so that it can grow
I'm
and drive
100% agree with you.
Okay.
But is that the purpose of a development budget?
Well, this
No,
is where
it's a wider purpose.
Yes, but this is
But
where
it's
we're
not the
saying
purpose of aid.
doing a diversification, because one of the issues that I've been always talking about is that linking the dots. We do humanitarian, we don't do development, we don't do peace building, and then what do we end in? Just a repetitive cycle of funding and funding and funding with no end in sight.
Well, what we're seeing, sorry now, is not repeated circles, but concentric circles, because the aid budget is getting smaller and smaller.
Which is true.
And not going to the places it needs to be going to.
Barry, from an EU perspective and Ireland's role as within the presidency of the European Council, Dominic made the point there that the UN can't deliver its mandate on the UN Charter or peace or whatever else if the, let's say, permanent members of the Security Council aren't in agreement either. How can Ireland do similarly if certain member states aren't on board with prioritising development space, the civil society space?
Yeah, I wouldn't underestimate the size of the challenge involved in that. The reality is that there is a move away from increasing ODA. In fact, Ireland is one of only 2 countries in the European Union that has increased it in the last year. So there is a weight of expectation on the Irish presidency that they will deliver certain things, but let's not be coy about it. We can't deliver them unless everybody's on board to deliver them. However, I've learned in the last, just speaking to colleagues around Europe in the last couple of months, is that they very much want to conclude negotiations during our presidency wherever that's possible for 2 reasons. The first is that Ireland is a very experienced president of the European Council, so we bring with us a record and an experience there that they want to serve in terms of the delivery of the MFF, for example. And the next president to be Lithuania, without any disrespect to Lithuania, they don't have the same level of experience. But the second thing is, and it's been mentioned, the extent to which we have witnessed political volatility in recent years, there is more potentially coming next April in French presidential elections, for example. So as we move into the end of the Lithuanian presidency, the beginning of the Greek presidency, we don't know what the landscape is going to be like. So if decisions haven't crystallized by the end of our presidency, there is a concern for many Europeans that it's going to be harder and harder to do that in 2027. That's perhaps the greatest weapon in our arsenal.
Indeed. Does that put pressure on
Exactly,
other countries? Yeah.
And I think the great skill that Irish officials and Irish people have is that actually they have a way of wending these things into negotiations that isn't adversarial, because we're not. Within the European Union, I hope we're not a threat anyway, but I think generally speaking, Ireland is not usually a competitor with many of the countries who are going to be big decision makers on this. And so there isn't an adversarial aspect, but there is also, if you look, and this is not something I'm saying about Ireland myself, this has been said to me by other countries, there is a charm to Irish negotiations that makes it slightly easier to go along with things. That's what I've been told. I've never been in these negotiations, so I don't know. But the hope is that during our presidency, when we are chairing meetings, when we are steering the agenda, that we will be able to use those factors to get to places where we want to get.
The only thing is, though, Lithuania is taking over the presidency after us, and notwithstanding, the very important points about everybody, including President of the European Council, Tony Costa, is really putting pressure on Ireland, saying he wants most things sewn up by November. But countries like Lithuania may look at Ireland's priorities and say, hold on a second, we're spending nearly 6% of our GDP on defence, obviously because we have this daily threat from Russian aggression. We're not on board with the space that Ireland has or holds for whether it's civil society. I'm not saying that they're not interested in it, but the prioritisation of international development isn't something that they would like to see, because they want the main priority being defence and security.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think Irish people and Irish civic society and Irish politicians have not yet gotten their head around the existential risk that exists in terms of what's happening. We are physically the furthest away from the conflict in Ukraine, but you talk about Lithuania, you talk about Poland, you talk about countries that are right next to it who have been much closer to the fighting. It is a live issue, and I think security is obviously one of our presidential priorities, but it is not to the forefront of our minds in real terms the way it is to the forefront of most European states. So when you talk about the frugals, for example, no two ways about it, you're absolutely right. Their focus will be much less on the values part of our presidency than it will be on the security part of our presidency, for example, and that is a challenge. But I do think that we have an opportunity. What's interesting is I was speaking to a German colleague 2 weeks ago in Berlin who said, I was talking to him about the German cuts to the overseas development aid budget, and he said, yes, but because we have cut it, Europe can't. Now, if that were repeated, now he's a parliamentarian, he's not going to be making decisions on this, but if that view is repeated, and he's not, he's the same party as me, he's CDU, so he's not,
super left.
I didn't want to say it, but yeah, he'd be somebody I would expect not to hold that view. But the fact that he said that gives me hope that there are people within the European polity who recognise that failure to invest in ODA is failure to invest in other people's problems outside the European Union is to store up their problems for us in the future. And failure to help them address them is really going to bring them to our shores in a way that can be avoided if we have the foresight to do it.
And just before I let you go on that, because there's also an argument from them saying, well, Ireland spends very little on defence and security. We spend an awful lot. So it's all very well being so geographically dislocated from the Russian aggression, which not just happening in Ukraine, it's happening in Lithuania, all across the Baltics every day. They might say, well, look, we don't have this MFF budget, to spend on development. We really need to just focus. And I just, one of my points is that the Irish charm doesn't work in that regard.
No, you're absolutely, that's what I say, I wouldn't underestimate the size of the challenge. However, like all budgets, it's all about choices that need to be made. Nobody's suggesting, for example, we stop spending money on everything and spend it all on security. So money will be spent on other things. And yes, the amount of money being spent on security will be ramped up. There will be greater money available for states in terms of everything from SAFE to all the other programs that are there to help states realistically to arm themselves. We talk about security. Most countries talk about defence in real terms. But these all come down to political choices that have to be made. And the reality is there will be money in the EAS budget. There will be money for overseas development. The question is, how much is it going to be diluted? How much of it is going to be taken out for other things? And let's not either ignore things like CAP. There's going to be an enormous discussion about agricultural subsidies that is also going to create pressure. It's not just security. So there are constantly those competing interests. The job, I think, of the Irish negotiators chairing meetings over the next 6 months will be to constantly steer that decision and to try to include the benefit of overseas development aid as a security concept, not just an us helping them concept, because I think we need to move away from that. Yeah. I think we need to look at, I know we were talking about whether it's a selfish interest or not. I'm not saying it should be selfish, but actually sometimes it can be more potent when you talk to people who are against it in the context of their self-interest as well.
Alexei, what do you, as a security concept is probably moving it a bit in a different direction, but that general point that Barry made.
I think that's crucial, and that's the point I made. I think the Global Gateway is going in that direction and has managed to bring back some political traction and usefulness to international development cooperation, because we're doing that also in our own interests. I think that's really playing out strongly in the MFF negotiations, and you're totally right. I think we need to look at the bigger battles that are taking place. Obviously, the big battles will definitely not take place on the Global Europe pillar. Only 10%. The big battles we heard around agriculture, cohesion, competitiveness perhaps. Just last week, the European leaders discussed the so-called negotiating box with the first counter-proposal by the member states on the overall budget. And I think this is quite illustrative. We're far from the end of the process there, but it shows a bit where the power dynamics are taking us. Overall, there was a general cut of 4% across the whole MFF, 2% across the whole MFF. But some pillars were disproportionately affected, and that includes Global Europe, which was cut by 4%. So that was a proposal. Some were relatively preserved, and typically that's around cohesion and agriculture. And I think this really illustrates where the battles are. Just to bring us back to the last MFF negotiations, where the Global Europe, or Europe in the World, or neighborhood and development was cut by 10%. So we are still probably facing even more serious cuts moving forward. And I think in that context, it's really important. Of course, there are many crucial discussions to be had around where development and international cooperation are going. But let's not lose sight of what are the priorities of the day around security, defense, around competitiveness. These are the priorities which are clearly framing the discussions. And the risk is indeed that global Europe altogether, development or humanitarian aid in particular, might be cut very severely moving forward if there's not indeed a strong alliance to defend, to preserve, and to, I think, justify why it is crucial, it is existential, including for our own interests, to continue investing and engaging with partners on a long-term basis, and not just to seek immediate gains, geopolitical or economic gains, but it is really important. And I think that's really for everyone to make that case beyond the people in the room. I'm actually more interested perhaps about what the people outside this room are thinking and where their priorities are. So I think that's really important. And I do think that the Irish presidency will be essential in that regard to connect. We try to connect the dots in our organization in the negotiations on the MFF, so on the different files, which are still pretty much disconnected and held in silos. That's the institutional reality of the EU. They're very siloed in the different council working groups. But I think the effort that the Irish presidency will want to connect how investing externally or being present and engaging externally is linked to our own security and competitiveness. I think this is a strong political argument that we need to make today.
Emily, you wanted to go in there?
Yeah, I wanted to come in on that exact point because I think historically, if you look at the data, Europe has been quite a balanced security actor. It's balanced its investments across kind of defense, development, and diplomacy in quite a positive manner. But obviously, it's logical with the threat on the eastern border. Defense budgets are rising really rapidly, and actually, you're seeing that balance being eroded. But then when you look at kind of over a 10-year horizon, what are some of the biggest threats that the world is going to be facing a decade from now? None of them are military in nature. Most of them are related to things like the climate crisis, from future health threats, for example. So I think there is a way that we need to be a bit smart about how we present ODA as kind of a strategic enabler, as something that helps us with kind of like a broader definition of security. And I think that can be an argument that is very persuasive when we're facing down potential cuts in the future and in future rounds of these negotiations.
Yeah, go. I was going to ask you. Yeah, go.
Sorry, I came over all George Orwell as you were talking there. All pillars are created equal, but some pillars are more equal than others.
Or more fragile.
And I think that's what we're going to face. I think you're exactly right. I think the fundamental difference between these MFF negotiations and the last ones are Trump and Putin. Trump, because of his failure to sort of commit to NATO and Article 5, Putin because of what's happening in Russia. And I think that's going to have a disproportionate impact on the thinking, particularly of the border states, that are their biggest immediate reality and threat, as Barry said and you've said, Shona, is security. So if the overall budget is cut from the commitment that was provisionally raised, and we had Mertz talking about it the other day, cut 2%. We had the IMPA commissioner, who's... Sikela, thank you. Sitting here in Dublin 2 weeks ago saying, well, all the member states are cutting, so the EU will cut as well. You can't expect us to increase the aid budget. I mean, it's a really stark statement. If you look what happened with the last MFF negotiations, the pledge to give an extra $1 billion to humanitarian aid was shunted at the last minute to give it to development and then shunted out of the budget altogether. We are too small an actor that if we don't mobilize the support that you've talked about and that the Minister talked about earlier on, there is a serious danger that the aid budget will be cut. And that's what worries me in the context where we are in absolute crisis. The number of people in need, the number of people displaced, the impact of conflicts, whole countries having their aid budgets cut. We are in absolute crisis. The OCHA hyper-prioritization is an admission of failure. It's not a solution to the funding crisis. It's the failure of the international system to actually respond to the level of needs globally that are growing at a rate that we may not be able to get back under any degree of control. Sorry.
No, just need a bit of a pause there because it's so stark and really quite frightening, quite frankly. Do you want to come in there, Nadine?
Well, it's funny because I had received a couple of days ago a brief summary about the GHA report from ALNAP.
Yeah.
And I was looking now, as you are talking, I was looking into the percentage of money that is allocated to aid. And we're talking, about 0.06%. There has been a proposal for the EU proposal for the 0.07% of gross national income. And I cannot talk about that because we are receiving it. So, but when I look into the proportion of what has been allocated to development and what is allocated to defense, I'm like, these two cannot be compared. Honestly, this is not an honest and fair way to look into things. I understand where countries are coming from, but at the same time, I believe that we have not learned anything from COVID. During COVID, nobody was safe until we're all safe. Now, it's back to for each his own. So I am safe, you guys do whatever you want. If I look into my region and the Mediterranean and the EU, a lot of the issues that I've been hearing and I've heard was about illegal migration, was about illegal trade. And then going back to the question, would aid help in, remedying to this issue? Maybe. But what we have been doing previously did not, because we have been doing just humanitarian, just enough for people not to lose hope, not to lose, this small, tiny thing that still connects them with life. What would make anybody take the risk of going into the Mediterranean on a boat that has no safety unless nothing at home would have been better? Yeah. So for me, if you want to really look into defense, you cannot put it aside from what is happening in the other countries that might create an additional risk. So again, pushing what do I want the Irish presidency to do? To push for having a really realistic look in terms of what is driving everything that's happening around us. What is creating those risks for the EU and for the EU member states? And how can, whatever support is given to really help the people, putting them really at the center and not to help the system feel better or not to help, all the politicians being able to go back to their constituency and say, I promised you cut of aid, I'm doing cut of aid.
Do you think, Barry, that there is a recognition amongst politicians about the correlation between, proper development aid, support for civil societies, reconstruction, and so on in countries, and migration and refugees, and the fact that obviously, like you said there, who puts their children into a boat from Turkey or wherever else in order to get to Europe, leaves their belongings behind, puts everybody's life at risk. They don't do that unless they're in dire need.
I think there is among some politicians, and I think it varies from state to state, never mind from party to party. I mean, if you're an Italian politician, there is much greater pressure on you in relation to what's happening with illegal migration into their country, people fleeing in exactly the circumstances that you've described. So if you're a Mediterranean country, it's a much more acute issue than if you're a Nordic country, for example. And I think that you do see politicians who understand that difference, but as I said earlier, there are two countries in the European Union that have not reduced their ODA budgets, which doesn't tell me that there is a great political appreciation for that issue. And I think that unfortunately, it is the nature of politics that we are affected by the present and the connectable, and to make the connection between the lack of, the political instability, the lack of overseas development aid, the lack of investment by Europe, particularly in the countries that surround it that need that assistance, to connect that to what other people see as problems here in terms of migration, in terms of other security issues. That connectivity is harder to establish than the fact that this problem is here now. And even in Ireland, I think, where we have increased the ODA budget, even in Ireland you will see a certain sector of the polity that is telling you that this problem is here and will never connect it to policies at a European or Irish level that may have caused it.
What two countries did you say haven't reduced their...
Ireland and Spain are the only two as far as I know.
Spain, yeah.
The two that increased.
Yeah,
They've increased, I thought you said, yeah.
We're the only two that didn't decrease, and we're also the only two that increased. I think that's correct, isn't it?
Just before I go to the audience, Emily, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Barry. I mean, I think from the conversations that we've been having in Brussels, there does seem to be an increasing understanding about the role that ODA plays across like Europe's priorities, not only in terms of its external action objectives, right? But my fear, I suppose, is that we're at the very beginning of these negotiations on the next 7-year budget. Like the real trade-offs haven't started to happen yet. So I think there's two things that we as civil society can do, right? Which is one, continue to make the case about how ODA is a strategic enabler across a range of different policy priorities of the European Union. But the second is to start thinking about kind of what coalition of countries is needed to mount a bit of a collective defense on the EU's external action budget in these negotiations. And as you say, Ireland and Spain make kind of very, very good candidate countries for that. But I think the frugals are quite interesting in this particular negotiation, because you have the Netherlands historically, takes a frugal stance on all EU budget negotiations, but you have a new government where they've said in their new MFF position they want to see the external action heading cut as little as possible. You then have Germany, on the other hand, who is saying very clearly they don't want to see disproportionate cuts that would impact heading 3 more than other headings. So I think there's something that we can work with there. And then you have the kind of the traditional allies. You have Spain, Portugal, maybe Belgium, Luxembourg. Perhaps the new Danish government also can be interesting here. And I suppose what I think would be very interesting from a civil society point of view would be, for us who have colleagues who work in other capital cities and other member states, to think through how we can kind of coordinate that and try and build this kind of collective coalition in the same way that, agriculture or cohesion funding, they have their friends of cohesion groups. They have them who, they release non-papers, they talk, before negotiations, they strategize on a common position. Can we create something across a group of like-minded member states that would do a similar job for external action? And I think that would be something that, we should collectively take action on in the coming weeks and months.
The Friends of Global Europe.
Yeah, I just want to say very briefly on that, because I think Emily's touched on an issue. An official in DFA said to me last week that all of the ministers have learned all of the names of their counterparts. So when they're chairing meetings, they have already built the relationships. Now, some of them will be new, obviously, with a new government in Hungary and that kind of thing. But the Irish governments will know to go to Jean or Inez or whoever it is around the table. And I think exactly what Emily said, that they have identified who the people they need to get on board are, and they're building those relationships. That has been happening probably for over a year. So that work is being done. As I said earlier, not to underestimate the scale of the challenge, nor would I underestimate the amount of preparation that has been done for this and how ready we are for it as well. So I would have a hope that we have ministers who are very well placed where there is a possibility of building alliances to build those alliances.
And of course, governments change. I know that for the Slovenian government has changed its position when it comes to Palestine, for example. It was very much supportive of Palestine, recognised Palestine, has its own occupied territories bill, and now with the new government under Janša, it's changed its position altogether. So there's peaks and troughs. And anyone like to ask the panel a question? This lady here.
Thanks so much. Susan Murphy from Trinity College and from the Development Studies Association of Ireland. Just want to say a huge thank you to the panel for a really, really stimulating and fascinating conversation today. I was really struck by the comments from Dr. Saba where she talked about the COVID lessons. And I think, just to quote you, you say nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And it reminds me very much of the ILO and the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. Poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. And it very much feeds into that notion of ODA as that strategic enabler. It's a form of enlightened self-interest. It's not about beneficence in and of itself. But that then brings me to the first. My question really is very much aimed towards Dr. Jones's comments around the global gateway and the opportunities that this presents. I think you're quite right in positioning this in the sense that Europe is focused on its competitiveness, on the digital transformation, and on the energy transformation, and Global Gateway is central to that. However, how do we balance those risks, and how do we recognise those risks? And there's 3 risks I really appreciate commentary around. The first one relates to the question of with the shift towards loans rather than grants, the question of building unsustainable debt, right? So again, it's interesting this morning, I haven't heard the word debt mentioned anywhere, and I think that's a really important consideration when we think about the implications for recipient states. The second question relates to using public funds to support the private sector. So again, I kind of come to the, we've heard this fairly frequently. There's a concern around socializing the risk and privatizing the gain. So how are we thinking about those risks, and how might they be mitigated? And then the third question relates to the prosperity or the prospect of rising inequality. So I think when we think about rising inequality, thinking at a moment when the global economy has just birthed its first trillionaire, we do need to give consideration to rising inequality and the implications essentially of the type of development that can be facilitated through the Global Gateway. And I suppose my question really is, when we think about rising inequality and we think about the circumstances into which funding is flowing, we know, if we look, for example, at climate action, we know that if funding is flowing into spaces that don't have strong institutions, strong democratic systems, thriving civil society, and support for radical redistribution, then inequality is very likely to follow, even if you have economic growth in those contexts. So my question is, looking at the budget of the Global Gateway of 200 billion, and looking at, I think this morning I heard a figure of 50 million given towards strengthening civil society, to what extent is that sufficient to mitigate that risk? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take that?
I can just start and let the most challenging ones. I think the Global Gateway has indeed contributed to changing the narrative, the story that the EU wants to tell around its engagement internationally and specifically on development cooperation. The forces, the political forces, the constraints, the ODA cuts predate already, and there was a downward trend. It became very flagrant in the past couple of years, but there was a loss of traction of development cooperation, I would say specifically ODA in that context. So I do think the Global Gateway narrative and story has helped to bring a bit more of raison d'être, to justify a bit more and in a new type of language why it's important that the EU remains engaged, but also vis-à-vis partner countries that were criticizing more and more the EU's approach, the double standards, the hiding between charity and solidarity objectives, but at the same time more and more pushing for its own interests around migration, specifically of the past few years, private sector, also economic interest more recently. But it's true that with that comes new ways of working, new approaches, new actors actually that we want, and that was the intention. We want to bring in international and development cooperation because they have resources. Let's face it, we need private resources for that, and the leverage that the EU is trying to create through the Global Gateway and innovative financing tools is precisely for that purpose. But it does bring new types of relations, new types of funding, loans, which create debt, and supporting private sector, and the question that raises around, is ODA limited resources meant for that initially? So there are, I think, still many consequences of the Global Gateway and the new approach that haven't been properly thought through. I think what the Commission and the EU is trying to do at the moment is with this 360-degree approach, try to compensate a bit, and this links maybe to the discussion we had in the first panel, around what are the forgotten dimensions, aspects of the Global Gateway that are crucially important, just as if not more important for long-term development. But I agree with you, there are many, many questions that are left unanswered. But that's, I guess, the trade-off you need also to face when you try to bring in new actors, new tools, new ways of working, new timeframes as well. I think that's also a very important question that we haven't faced, is that those different actors function with very different modalities and timeframes.
I want to jump in on the capacity strengthening, because I have grown this habit of being extremely picky when somebody says capacity strengthening for local and national organizations. Actually, local and national organizations are not a homogeneous group. And not everybody needs capacity strengthening. Some of the local and national organizations can themselves do capacity strengthenings for others. So for me, whenever anybody speaks about capacity strengthening, I do like to ask some questions in terms of what does that entail? Is this only an issue of, we've helped them draft the policy? Perfect. Did you help them acquire the tools to implement that policy? We've helped them strengthen their internal control. Did you get them an accounting software that would help them do that? So for me, whenever anybody speaks about, capacity strengthening, and I believe that now with the funding cuts, more and more of this will be inexisting. Yeah. I would like to think more about how can we really strengthen the ecosystem within a specific context. How can we work with networks and not only with individual organizations to be able to have some shared resources, to be able to abide more with the compliance, to be able to be more innovative in their financing. Think about innovative financing, how to do blended finance, how to ensure that they are doing all this work that others has been doing and just handing it to them. So for me, whenever anybody speaks about capacity strengthening, I get to be curious to understand what they mean by it, because it could mean anything from, we wrote them the policy until we really worked with them and mentored them for them to be able to get through and move. So for me, at this moment, one of the things that I would what I would want to see in terms of capacity strengthening is to work with networks so that they can leverage their membership, they can support their membership, and this is how we're creating a more interactive civil society context. So for me, this is a question that I would like to ask as well. What do we mean by capacity strengthening for local and national organization in this time?
And Barry, we also heard there from that lady from Trinity College about, we have the world's first trillionaire, just so happens to be the first person, the person who gutted USAID. We heard from Commissioner McGrath earlier, he gave an introduction speech. I mean, a very important part of this is international law and international humanitarian law and human rights law. Is that's slipping? Do you think it's slipping at an EU level as well?
I do. Roberta Metsola was in the Oireachtas yesterday, and I actually raised this issue with her. We are lucky in Ireland that we have the most approval amongst the populace of any country for European Union membership, 82%. And I think for Irish people, one of the very important parts of the value that we associate with EU membership is the values of preservation of international law and the rule of law and the human rights elements that come with that. I think that's really important here. And I think one of the areas where Europe has absolutely disappointed us is in Gaza, for example. And I said this to Roberta Metsola because she and Ursula von der Leyen went to Tel Aviv in the aftermath of the October 23 attacks. And I understand why, but they stood next to an Israeli minister who was openly saying he was going to break international law, and they said they stood with them. I think that was outrageous and disgraceful. And I say that where both of those politicians are members of the same party as me.
But what was her response to that?
She didn't respond to that. And, I'd said it to her privately afterwards, and she didn't really respond to the substance of it at all. Ursula von der Leyen, in fairness to her, has acknowledged what she calls a man-made famine. She has apologised for going to Tel Aviv in October 23. Roberta has not, but I don't think she has been called upon to do so publicly. But the point I'm making is not these people made a mistake, because they did. The point I'm making is that there was a body of opinion within Europe that made it okay for them to do that. And for some reason, there is a blind spot in European politics at the moment that says that we will come down on Russia like a ton of bricks when they break international law and invade a country of white Christians, if I can put it that way. But when another country invades in an unjustifiable way a country of coloured Muslims, it's different. And I honestly believe that is what is at the heart of the differentiation between the two conflicts. They're both heinous, they're both contrary to international law, they are both awful, awful things. And yet Europe has been absolutely clear in what it said about Russia and absolutely garbled in what it's, in fact, it has been clear in what it's said about Israel, but in the wrong way. And building the consensus, and references talked earlier about how Slovenia has changed, and there's been a huge amount of criticism of the government here for not doing enough. I don't agree with that. And you might say there's a politician backing up his party. I genuinely think if you look at it objectively, Ireland has been the strongest voice against this kind of ambiguity within the attitude to the rule of law. But what's much more important than that, because we are a small, militarily non-aligned state in the west of Europe, we do not have the capacity to stop what's happening. But the thing that I was talking about earlier, I used the word charm, which is perhaps not the right charm, but the diplomatic, the soft power that we have is actually enormous. And if you look at what Ireland has done, we have built a coalition now, and it's not just, it is Slovenia, it's Belgium, it's Sweden, or Spain particularly, Malta, the Netherlands, even France I think is changing now in terms of its attitude. That is the power that we have. But I really do worry, and this is what I said to her yesterday, I think what Israel is trying to do at the moment is achieve a silent Nakba in Gaza, and it is largely being silent because Europe is ignoring it. And I am really worried that the complete failure of Europe to deal with this really obvious breach of international law on our doorstep is going to fracture particularly Irish people's relationship with their faith in Europe as the defender of international law.
And I suppose the point isn't that Ursula von der Metsola went to Israel to sympathise with Israelis who were savagely attacked as well, but that they stood by as the government policy was to cut off food, fuel and water to a besieged population.
It's kind of strange, but I should have said, and you're obliged as a politician to, if you're making a comment the way I just did there, to make the prelude that, of course, what Hamas did was awful. I mean, what an obvious thing to say. I mean, Hamas is a horrible terrorist organisation that has literally sacrificed the civilian population of Gaza on the altar of its political ambition. That goes without saying. But exactly as you say, it's the notion that two leading European politicians went to Tel Aviv, and as the Israeli government was announcing what it was going to do, which is clearly contrary to international law, the words out of their mouths were, "We stand with you." And that is totally inconsistent with what Europe is about, which is all about the rule of law, all about having something that you can rely on as following the rules-based order. And at the moment, I honestly think there is a real problem in Europe in that regard.
Next, this lady here.
Thank you very, very much, everyone. My name is Rose Dumal. I've been living in Ireland for 29 years. I'm from Belgium. I'm a very proud European. I live right outside of Brussels. But right now, I'm very ashamed of the EU. I've been working with my organization, International Community Dynamics, on the other side of the spectrum that you are working on. So the ones from abroad who didn't profit from the trickle-down economy or who are suffering from climate change, and the people, so the refugees and asylum seekers who came here. And my big disappointment is to see, first of all, the EU, what has happened there with Israel, I think is just unacceptable, as you say, and thank you for saying that. But also, 2 years ago or something, when the UK said they would send asylum seekers to third countries, the whole world stood up against it. And the whole world was saying that's terrible, that's against human rights and all that. Is it 2 weeks ago that the EU now agreed to send people to third countries?
No, it's okay, it's okay. It's okay.
To send people to third countries and lock them up there. People who are not accepted in Ireland or in Europe, and among them are people who are fleeing from climate change, who cannot live in the hot countries they are in, because that is not the reason to be a refugee right now. It's not accepted. So those people will be locked up in places like, I don't know where.
Can you just put the microphone to your mouth?
Is it working again? Yeah. In places like Libya, where we all know that human rights are being violated in the extreme. Morocco, where people are being killed at the front, at the borders. So my question is, how can you say that we want to introduce the respect for human rights in the EU? We want to bring that into the development area, because I don't see it anymore. And I'm seriously disappointed, and I'm hoping that this presidency can make also people who are coming from these countries and who are now Irish, they should be here. They should be able to give their input into what is happening. And so how will you promote EU active citizenship in society for new citizens? I think it's very important. And how will you deal with this flagrant, awful thing like locking people up in third countries, which is completely against human rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to take that point? Those points? Anyone? No.
Is it going to fall to the politics?
I could.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I cannot say how it is and how it could be done, but what I can say is that I believe that even in 10 or 15 or 20 years, we will always have this conversation, because we will always have politics, and then we will always have law and international law and human rights law. So I believe it's going to be a never-ending question whereby politicians will have to go with whatever public opinion wants and dictate, and we still want to keep on influencing and trying to influence and trying to push for that.
It is moving a bit to the right. I mean, you're from the EPP, which has basically worked with the far right on this on this legislation in the European Parliament. I mean, and the scenes in the European Parliament a couple of weeks ago when they were chanting, the far right chanting, "Get them out." I mean, that was obscene.
I agree.
Yeah,
it's unseemly.
Fine Gael tends to be not very much at the centre of the EPP anymore. Even I mean, the first time you've ever been heard that you've been called left, but like you'd be.
Although I've also rejected that notion. I think Irish politics is centrist. If we're a right of centre parties don't introduce the politics that Fine Gael has introduced over the last number of years, whether it's marriage equality, access to abortion, divorce reform, keeping social welfare rates, etc. But that's another day's debate. Yeah. I agree with. I thought what we saw in the European Parliament was unseemly and disappointing and disgusting. I would go as far as to say. My understanding is that the people chanting that were the far right. But the EPP worked with the far right to pass that legislation. The European People's Party, of which Fine Gael is a member, voted for it. I'm proud of the Irish MEPs who did not vote for it. But I think that I would say two things. I'm not in any way going to defend that policy or the notion that we would export migration. I don't hold with it at all. However, I would not go as far as you have as to suggest, like, Europe is still a fantastic place in terms of human rights. And Europe has a very proud record to stand on. It does not mean everything's perfect. But I wouldn't throw the baby out of the bathwater either in terms of what we have achieved in the human rights sphere. I am worried that there's a slippage. And I think you can see that across the world in terms of just the disintegration of sensible politics. I hope we'll be able to reclaim that a little bit, maybe even with the help of Fine Gael within the EPP, I don't know. But it's not perfect by any means, but I wouldn't either suggest that it's a terrible place. We have made progress.
I'm going to give everyone a little minute or so to wrap up. Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think you also raised like a very important point that's going to be like a really critical fault line in the last part of these negotiations, right, is this idea of migration conditionality. Should Europe stop any kind of investment, whether it's ODA or humanitarian, whether it's to civil society organizations or otherwise, if they do not cooperate on returns and readmissions? And that is an issue that has not been resolved at all, and I think the European Parliament is actually going to be a key battleground for this. And what the EPP decides to do on that particular issue is going to be absolutely crucial. So I would love to work with you and make sure that, when it comes to, the vote in the European Parliament, that we have, very strong voices within the EPP group saying aligning with the far right on this issue is not the way to go, because not only is it the wrong thing to do morally, but I think it's also going to be catastrophic for the European Union in terms of its offer and its positioning globally.
I noticed I didn't say anything about my talking points in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what local and national NGOs would want. I believe that, in terms of flexibility within the instruments and the financing, this is something that is really needed for local and national NGOs to adapt to whatever crisis they are facing. I believe implementing the nexus, linking the dots, I'm not calling for politicization of aid, but what I'm calling for is to really look into the root cause of a problem that we see in a context and try to support that rather than, just swipe it under the rug and, you get something in return and that's it. And the third point is really try to, as you said, go out of the capital, but not only go out. Local and national NGOs are talking and speaking, but I'm wondering if people are listening. So now it's not only the time for local and national NGOs to talk, it's also the time for their interlocutors to listen and to act upon it. Thank you.
Dominic.
I mean, I think first of all, it's important that Dóchas have hosted this today. I think it's great that so many people are here. I think the panels have been very good and very interesting. I come away from it concerned that we've talked a lot about instruments. We've substantially neglected the legal basis of humanitarian development aid within the EU, and we obviously have very different understandings as how that is best delivered. I'm concerned that I've heard little here today that I think is going to improve the circumstances for people living in acute and growing risk around the world in growing numbers. And we need to make sure we bring the conversation back to how best and where best do we use the limited and possibly declining budgets that we have. And that has to be to focus on fragile states. That really, my big takeaway from this is that is what I would call across the board, if Ireland is going to focus on something, protect the budgets and make sure the aid budget is spent in the right places, not in the promotion of aid, because that's not a development strategy.
Alexi, can you, when you wrap up, could you respond to something to that point that Dominic has made there about the focus or lack thereof on fragile states?
Well, just last week, I think a couple of weeks ago, the Commission issued a communication on fragile states remaining engaged and changing the approach on that. So it's still there among many other things, politically among the priorities. I do agree that that is the gray zone, if not the black zone, where Global Gateway literally simply doesn't apply, is not meant for that. And if everything is about Global Gateway, we do have a problem. So that's indeed perhaps where aid, limited aid, public resources should be focused on. Maybe as a wrap-up, and I think the question of values is perhaps most striking around the question of migration. We've seen how things can shift. This is also partly due to how the EU is constructed, difficult for the EU to speak with a common voice on sensitive matters like that in foreign policy. The shift of politics in the parliament also is very important. Maybe one point, because from our research, and that's maybe what the EU is losing sight of, is that the soft power, the values, there have been a lot of criticisms around double standards. I mentioned that earlier, there still is. But this is still, according to what we hear, what partners around the world value the EU for is a distinct feature of the EU, its focus on values. And I think here, for the Irish presidency, that precisely wants to re-insufflate some of these values.
But does that exist anymore? I mean, look at the point that Barry is making and the scenes in the European Parliament. I mean, you do hear this a lot from the EU, the Commission, you know, that the European Union is a reliable partner for trade, for everything else, because it can be guaranteed to defend the rule of law, because it is nothing else if not a union of laws. But, like, can we really say that anymore when you look at the situation with Palestine, when the EU-Israel Association Agreement is being flagrantly breached and the EU doesn't want to do anything about it, migration and so on? Like, can the EU still say that?
Values is not about what you say, it's about how you act.
Well, okay, so can they say
so
that
the
based
EU
on what they
says
have
a lot, it's there, it's in our treaty, it's everywhere, we say it. It's important how we act, and specifically in international development cooperation, how you conduct the partnerships. And maybe just three principles or values which I think would need to be brought back on the agenda, and the way the EU engages around agency. So recognizing that partner countries also have their own priorities, needs. So you need to recognize that it's a fact, and you can't just impose new ways of working and priorities. So that's when you talk about mutual interests, it's important to see also what are the interests coming from the other side, or whose interests are put on the table first. I think that's really important in the way you conduct partnerships. Inclusion. We talked a lot about inclusion of civil society, local authorities, local partners in general. That also is losing a bit of traction, so needs to be brought back up quite strongly in EU partnerships. And one last point, I think, is the long-term commitment. Nobody thinks in those terms today. It's very hard, crisis after crisis, but I think what distinguishes development cooperation is precisely this long-term vision, or let alone medium term. It's not about short-term gains. And I think this is a distinct feature of development cooperation which needs also to be brought back in.
Okay, well, thank you so much for our excellent panel, for really another fascinating discussion. Dr. Alexia Jones, Dominic Crowley, Dr. Nadine Saba, Emily Wiggins and Barry Ward. And now I'd like to invite to the stage Director General of Development Cooperation and Africa Division, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Michael Gaffey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for staying for the whole morning. There's a really great interest, and I was just saying to Jane Ann inside, I don't think that there's any recent presidency where this type of discussion would have taken place the week before the presidency took off. So it is a really good moment for Ireland and for this community, if we would say. We have been engaging in, all of us have been engaging on the future of development cooperation in recent times, in recognition not just of the fact that 2030 is coming, but also that we are in the midst of what is really an existential crisis in terms of development cooperation, which of course, as we must realize, reflects the existential crisis that so many people in the world live in today. And I was at a meeting in Brussels, after which they asked me two very quick questions. One was, what would you like to see change in development cooperation immediately? And my answer to that was, I'd like to move away from short-term thinking and back towards long-term engagement, because development cooperation is long-term and the future of humanity is long-term and not just short-term. And secondly, what can the EU do? And what I really was thinking about that, and I said that the European Union is a really special historical grouping which was formed as a peace project and a project for prosperity. It's a project that is formed on the basis of values and on the basis of interests. And we need to, and Ireland has benefited hugely from that, as have all the countries of the European Union. But I think we are a very, very good example, along with a number of others, of countries that in living memory have had structural, economic and social transformation because we joined the European Economic Community, because we pooled sovereignty, because we were enabled to trade and become an outward-looking economy, and because we were the recipients of direct aid in the form of cohesion and structural funds. So there is a project that has worked inside the European Union. And I suppose what I'd like to see, or what we would like to see, is that we bear that in mind when we look to the development of our international partnerships. Partnerships that are, whether they are of mutual interest or whether whatever they are based on, they can be based on the values and interests that have allowed the European Union to be what it is in the world today. And I think, therefore, that we're spending too much time arguing and thinking over whether we should choose values or whether we should choose interests to promote them. The European Union is based on values, and the European Union always has interests. And I think we need to keep this to the fore as we look to the future of development cooperation. I think we also, in looking back over the last year, I'm a little more, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic this year, but we're more energized this year. Last year, we spent the time trying to assess the extent of the crisis we faced. And it was huge, and it remains huge. And as we looked at aid cuts and changes of emphasis in terms of policy across the world, what we realized is not only were we engaging more in short-term thinking, but there were words that we were no longer hearing. And they were words that we were almost using in the past, almost as cliches. But we realized we were not hearing in debates, even among like-minded countries, we weren't hearing the word poverty. We weren't hearing the word gender. We weren't hearing the word hunger. We certainly weren't hearing the word nutrition. And I would say that that's one point that I made at the meeting the other day. If there's one thing you want to do today that shows how development cooperation, or ODA, can work, it would be end acute child malnutrition. It can be done. It's quite simple. We have the funds, we have the technical means. We just need the will and the policies to do so. And so as we approached our presidency, we realized that it wasn't a burden, it's an actual opportunity for us. We can't direct the European Union during a presidency, but we have a platform. And we've discussed this with you, with civil society, over the past year. And I think what we realized was we need to be clear in what we want to achieve. We need to be consistent in how we say it and how we articulate it. And we need to express that so that everyone understands. And we need to know how to work the European Union and the institutions of the European Union. And so the first thing that we wanted to be clear on when it came to development, and I'll come to the MFF shortly, but when it came to development, we wanted to be clear that we need the conversation to happen at a political level. We need to restore the practice of having meaningful meetings of the FAC, the Foreign Affairs Council Development. And we made it clear from the start, we will have the informal meeting in Dublin, and we will hopefully, in collaboration with the Commission and the EAS, we will have the formal meeting on the 1st of December. We will have the full range of working group and other meetings, and we will be clear that what our priorities are. We won't pick too many priorities. We won't crowd the table with priorities that cannot be achieved in a 6-month or 5-month presidency, because August is when many people go on holidays, although the world doesn't stop. And we agreed that we would, through everything, look at issues of health, of gender, and of food. But that when it came to the ministers' meeting, we wanted them to be able to have a political discussion. And we decided that what we needed the ministers to do was to address the big topic of the future of development cooperation. Not to come up with the answer on the 31st of December, but to open up the discussion at the political level that hasn't been happening at the political level. Looking at the international context and looking at the European Union and what the European Union can do. And I think that we have an opportunity now that hasn't been available over the last year in the midst of the reaction to crises, in the midst of the reaction to the USAID closure, the reaction to other funds, cuts in ODA, and also the sense of uncertainty around policy approaches, and the lack of, as Alexia has said, of a real sense of purpose for our development cooperation. So I think we have a real opportunity to open up that debate now and to have it at political level. Now, it's happening at the time of the MFF, and we know this. I think somebody said today, oh, we're at the early stage of the MFF discussions. Just to be really clear, we're not. We're coming to the end of the MFF discussions. And I only say that because I think we just need to wake up to this. We've been discussing for the since last summer, very intensively within the EU, the structure and architecture of the new arrangements. And I won't go into that now, but we've had many discussions on protecting the proposal that 90% of global Europe should count as ODA, on how do we protect humanitarian funding, and a whole range of issues. But what's coming down the tracks now is the issue of the figures, the money. And those proposals will be coming, well, as you know, the Cypriot presidency brought forward proposals. There is already agreement, a partial general agreement on the overall approach. And so during the Irish presidency, there will be really difficult discussions on the money, on the funding. And I suppose we in this room today, civil society, ourselves, are very focused on global Europe. And rightly so, and global Europe isn't a huge proportion, it's a small proportion of the overall funding. But what we have to bear in mind is, as you lobby and as we internally lobby, is that at the heads of state and government level, they are not necessarily thinking about global Europe. They're thinking about the cap, they're thinking about cohesion, they're thinking about frugality. And global Europe, I suppose the important thing is that it's not seen as the easy area to cut. But as we look to kind of lobby with others and engage with others, there's also a challenge within our own system in terms of lobbying. And I think that's something that needs to be borne in mind here in this room and right across Europe. If you're lobbying for the best possible outcome in terms of global Europe, yes, talk to development ministers, but they won't decide it. It's prime minister level that's important at this stage. Ministers of finance and prime ministers. So obviously you engage development ministers, but you must lobby also at the European Council level, I would say. And don't be, any of us should not be complacent. I don't think the situation is as bad as some people feared it would be a month or two ago. But I think what's really important in the argumentation is that we build an understanding that for Europe, this Global Europe Fund isn't a charity fund. This Global Europe Fund isn't solely an expression of our values, and we argue that our values and interests are completely intertwined. But this Global Europe Fund is as much, I would argue, in the interests of the European Union as defence and security funding is. I don't think we have to get into a debate on you must choose defence and security or you must choose development, humanitarian, and other aspects of global Europe. They are the same thing when it comes to the future of Europe. And another thing we will do in our presidency is attempt to have a stronger focus at the foreign affairs level, but also in development, on Africa. There's a reason why Ireland's development programme is focused on sub-Saharan Africa, and that's because that is the geographic heart of the world's continual problem of extreme poverty. That is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And for Europe, as you look to the east and you see the threat and the challenge from the east, you must also look to the south, to our neighbours. Africa is part of our neighbourhood now. And we mustn't see it as a threat, but we must also recognise that we cannot cut ourselves off from Africa. That Europe and Africa will grow and develop together, but they won't grow and develop apart. And I think that's another reason why this Global Europe Fund is of direct interest to the European Union. So I would just say that we have, as Ireland, the opportunity now not so much to lead to the European Union or to direct the European Union. This isn't the old-style presidency where we took over and said what we thought should be happening while other people worked out in other rooms what actually might be happening, but we had a really strong directive role. It's much more nuanced now, but we have a platform. I think we have shown, and you'll see from the Minister's speech, that we're ready to take that platform, that we've put the issues on the table, but that it is really important that we use these months to build a greater understanding of why development cooperation is still important for the European Union. I would say also of why ODA is not just an old-fashioned thing from the past, but it's also really important for least developed countries, for fragile contexts, for conflict, and therefore, in that case, it is of real importance for the interests of the European Union. And in doing this, I don't think that the politicians can do it alone. I don't think that the officials and diplomats, no matter how charming they may be, can do it alone. I think that we need your civil society engagement, and that's why I think this session today has been so important and so hopeful. But it's just to say, hold us to account, but engage in a way that is meaningful, that is effective, and that is heard. And I think what we've heard today is that you're ready to do that, and we look forward to working really, really closely with you over the next 6 months. And I hope that when it comes to the end of the year, we can look each other in the eye and say at least we helped make some positive change. So thank you very much for being here today. Oh, thank you, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, to re-welcome Jane McKenna to the podium.
Thanks very much. Don't worry, not long until lunch, just a couple of minutes. So we'd be delighted, as you can see there on the screen, to get your feedback on this event. This is our first of 3 events that we're going to hold during the presidency. We will be also having a conference on fragility, looking at that question that came up today in terms of the multi-annual financial framework. What does this mean for fragile and conflict-affected states? And that's going to be at the end of September. And then we're going to also have a pre-COP conference on climate, which will take place here on the 3rd of November as well. So kind of 3 major events, I suppose, anchoring our presidency programme. There's a lot to, I think, unpack and digest, I think, from the session that we heard here today. And I think that the next 6 months will give us an opportunity to do just that. It's to mention that also this session has been recorded, so we're very happy that we'll be sharing this online, so you can share this with your colleagues or anyone who is unable to attend today. We also have Marguerite is here somewhere in the audience, who has been diligently capturing all of the discussions and will issue a post-conference report, so we'll be able to share some of those discussions and points. For those of you who weren't capturing every point in the discussion today, but we will be sharing that with you and having that online as well. And there will be a series of other events that you can participate in. We are rolling out a capacity building series for not only for our members, but for broader civil society to build your own knowledge and understanding around EU institutions and really how decisions are made, particularly when it comes to this policy space. So we'll be working with Common Good to deliver that in July, and there'll be follow-up sessions indeed with Concord and with ECDPM, who you heard from today as well. And also, just to mention that next week we got quite a lot of applications for our sub-granting programme. So this will be really around raising awareness about the EU's role in globally, essentially. And we'll be announcing that next week. There will be a number, up to 10 organisations that will receive funding to build awareness during the presidency, and we'll be delighted to also share that. So we will have a bi-weekly newsletter, so you can sign up to that as well. Keep an eye on our website. And I think it came across quite strongly today, is that, you know, it's not only that, you know, the Irish presidency is a good opportunity to engage and discuss these issues. I think it's extremely timely that we have the opportunity to have these discussions when a lot of the decisions are going to be made. And I think it's really up to us now here in the room to see how we can positively engage in those discussions with parliamentarians, with decision makers, with government departments to ensure that our voice is heard. And just lastly, I just want to say a big thank you to the Dóchas team. Many of you, you'll see we have a growing team. I think there's 11 of us now. So the whole team, but especially to our new presidency colleagues. So we have 4 new team members, Laura, Robbie, Kate and Katerina, who joined us only last month. So they've had a lot of work to do in the last month, not only in delivering this event, but also spinning a number of plates in terms of our presidency programme. So a big thank you to the team, and I think we're really looking forward to working with you. We're really looking forward to working with you, and we're very grateful that we have the opportunity from the European Commission to deliver this over the next 6 months. And for us as civil society, it's a really important opportunity that we have now to engage with a bit of funding to see how we can support you to do that. So thank you very much.